Hello and welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are taking a look at a blast from the past, a classic from 1996, the movie Fargo by the Coen Brothers. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you think of our reviews down in the comments below. We are always working to produce new content, so if you can, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out immensely, helps us out with the algorithm, and it keeps you in the loop of what we're doing because we're always cooking up new schemes. So Lee, I suggested we do a review of Fargo because this is part of a grander design that I have concocted up, where we take a look at 6 of the best Coen Brothers movies. Now, not last week, but the week before, Dara Sanders and we did a discussion of Burn After Reading, and upon watching Fargo, you can sort of see a theme running in these movies, but we'll get into that in a little bit. What do you remember about this movie? Because this came out around 1996, so we would have been in elementary school at that time. Was this something that you were aware of, or did you know anything about it?
I watched this when I was obviously much younger, and I probably haven't seen this in 20 plus years. So I wouldn't say that this was a blind review. I do, remember parts of Fargo. I think probably the most notorious scenes, especially like the ending, kind of stick out very well in my head. But
it's a very iconic scene. Like
absolutely,
it's sort of like the man tied to the chair with the other guy dancing and smoking a cigarette, like in Reservoir Dogs.
Yes.
It's that one particular it's that scene and the accent that people remember from.
Of course,
this movie.
yes. So yeah, absolutely, and that's why, like, when I was into this, like, I was like, oh yeah, well, let's watch Fargo, right? Because we were kind of going through some of the Coen Brothers, and I was like, gosh, I haven't seen Fargo in forever, and honestly, I'd forgotten much of it, and I think that this was very much a fun surprise for me to be going back and watch this because I didn't remember a lot about it, so. I was very much eager to watch this, and I have to admit, it was certainly enjoyable. And I think there's things that, as you kind of like get older and you start to, see more and more stuff, I think you can really appreciate a lot more of these movies. And I think Fargo definitely has kind of rekindled my appreciation for some of the stuff that I feel like we don't do as well now with modern movies.
I mean, especially with movies that try to follow a similar track as Fargo or any other Coen Brothers movies, because when you look at when you look at movies that are being made today, they kind of try to go for that quirky, dark humor. I mean, we talked about Mickey 17 a few weeks ago, and
I know, right?
and we were both on opposite ends of the spectrum, because I could appreciate the dark humor that it was going for, but you felt it kind of missed the mark. And that would seem to be the case with a lot of modern films that try to go for that sort of dark humor, but for one reason or another, they kind of either miss the mark or they kind of forget midway they're trying to be funny and they just make it really, really dark. So why don't you go ahead and take us into the magical wintry world that is Fargo.
Yes. So,
and don't forget to include the accent, because that's something that's really important,
Ooh, that's pretty good, Luca. I'm proud of you, dude. You know how to do that stuff. Like, I will not even bother. Maybe at the end I'll try to throw in some flair, but I'm absolutely terrible at that stuff.
Oh gosh, you don't need to be so modest. I mean, anybody can do it, Just go talk to your pastor down at the church. He's a very good Lutheran guy.
Jeez, how many years did you live in Minnesota for that one? So, but I would say kind of the first thing that was very interesting to me, right? And I totally forgot about this. It was based upon true events, and I'm going to put air quotes on true events. But did you recall anything about that? Like when you rewatched it?
I did some research about it, and I mentioned before we started recording, I actually started watching the TV series Fargo.
Yes.
And they do the exact same thing at the beginning of every episode. Now, as far as I know, it's not something that I could find that was very specific. I'm assuming there may have been a murder, but I mean, remember, this is 1996. I mean, we're in the middle of of a lot of things. I mean, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. We got Eric Rudolph running around doing a bunch of crazy shit, and then we got the Unabomber. So, I mean, so if there was anything that caught the Coen Brothers' imagination, it must have been on on the low key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like what I kind of looked up about it, a lot of the change the characters is just like kind of like, I guess some of the set pieces were utilized, but like the characters, how they were and everything like that are their imagination. So they say true events, but it's very I would be hard pressed to really say like a guy hires a bunch of people to kidnap his wife for ransom and gets caught. Not exactly when you think about it, not a super unique thing, right? I'm sure not.
I mean, now,
common, but
no, I mean, now unless they were looking at the headlines at the time and saw what was going on with like Amy Fisher and Joey Buttafuoco, and I thought, well, I mean, maybe we can take a story like this and like dial it to 11. I don't know. I mean,
there's some obviously a lot of creativity that went into it, but I thought it was kind of an interesting way to open it. And this is where I'll let you kind of talk more about this because you're obviously more of the film production type of guru, right? But even like the onset of the film, right? I just love the opening scene, right, where we see the car that's going to be utilized, right, for the kidnapping is kind of being driven down this road, and I love that the Coen Brothers, they kind of just like sit there and they just allow the scene to exist, right? You see all this snow, like it's pretty much like all white, right? And you just kind of see the car, and they probably spend like a good 30-40 seconds, but I think it really kind of captures the essence of what the movie's gonna be. And I love how they could just kind of get that by just allowing the scene to play out, right? Without there having to be like jump cuts and everything else happening. It's just a very slow, methodical scene, thinking back to, some of the, sweeping shots that we get from stuff like Lawrence of Arabia and everything like that. So I want to get your take, right, as someone that's really into like the cinematography and everything. How did you like how they filmed this and how they really captured kind of, I think, the isolation, the cold, and everything that we experience in this movie?
I mean, when I was in film school, I mean, we were always taught you don't want to keep a shot longer, than like 10 seconds, 10 or 15 seconds. Not 15 seconds, but at least 10 seconds or below, because you don't want it to linger. You kind of want to keep moving the shot around. I mean, what the Coen Brothers did is kind of buck convention, and a lot of what they do in this movie is going against convention. For me, it's not so much about the cinematography as it is about the sound, right? Because as sound plays a huge role in the
Absolutely.
way that that a movie is being made, and it's just so stark and so quiet at times, and it kind of normally it's not something that would be so bothersome, but given the nature of the movie and given the fact that we're talking about Minnesota and North Dakota, the Midwest in winter, that silence has a bit of an unease about it, right? So you're really at some point you're just begging there has to be some sort of like noise or something to kind of break the action. But at the same time you also the incidental noises you hear, so like the humdrum of a car dealership, right? Or going to a cafeteria and just sitting there and eating, or just driving down a lonely country road. You can sort of appreciate it because the Coen Brothers they're not gonna stuff it with unnecessary things. I mean, what they're giving you is the bare bones, and you kind of have to just make do with what they give you, right?
Mm.
What I really appreciate about the production aspect of it is the fact that it's not very pretty, right? Because with most films, whether regardless of the time period, they usually like to put you somewhere exotic, or they give you a lot of color, or they give you a lot of special effects.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a naked movie,
Yes.
in my opinion, because I mean, you've got nothing but snow all around you, snow and ice. It's just bare bones. The buildings around you, these look like buildings that have been around for 50-something years at the time that it was made, right? There really isn't that much color because obviously it's it's wintertime, but also, the fact that everything looks dead and dull and boring, very much akin to The Grave, it kind of lets you know this isn't a movie that should really make you comfortable, because of the fact that we see these two idiots going around trying to perform, a very basic kidnapping, and they can't even get that right, and
Yes.
they end up carving a bloody path all around them. So so the fact that the Coen Brothers are giving us a very stark atmosphere in both sound and image, I would say pretty much plays a part in the way that they're telling the story, right? Because if they told, and they do the same thing in the movie No Country for Old Men. Obviously, it's a very different environment. You get sand instead of snow, but the way that is executed, no pun intended, is still very much perfection, because it plays into the idea that this isn't an environment you need to be comfortable around. You need to feel unease and not know exactly what to expect. So with the way that that Fargo plays out, it's a movie that tries to make you feel uncomfortable around an area that we should be familiar with, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you mean with that. So, and I think we'll kind of talk about, kind of the general idea about the plot, right? And we really kind of just jump right into it. And, I think we get to meet the majority of our cast, right? In kind of the first scene here. So we have the movie starts off, we meet our car sales manager, Jerry, who's played by William H. Macy. And he's meeting up with these two criminals. All right, so you got Carl, who's played by Steve Buscemi, who was great. Really liked his role in this. And then I believe it's pronounced Guyar, played by Peter Stormare. I think I only heard the name twice. I think at the introduction part and then maybe one other time. So played by Peter Stormare. And William H. Macy, right? So his character Jerry, he is wanting to kind of employ these two criminals to help kidnap his wife. So this way he can, in essence, extort money from his rich father-in-law. And the whole premise of it, like, I think this is how you make a strong dark comedy, right? Because the whole subject matter is obviously messed up, right? Having a guy that's wanting to, kidnap, obviously doesn't have any plans of like harming his wife or anything, but in essence is just trying to do it because he's like afraid to talk to his wife about getting some extra money. I just thought that was just such an interesting thing. And I like how even the criminals, right? Steve Buscemi's character, Carl, like points out, like, why don't you just ask your wife? And he just kind of like is like, well, I can't because and he doesn't really get into it. And I just really enjoyed just like how they started with these characters. And we see like, Jerry is, putting this into play. And then while that's happening, he ends up kind of talking with Wade, right, his father-in-law, about like getting like a loan for like a parking lot. And Wade actually is very interested in this deal happening. So this is where kind of, I guess, the shenanigans start, right? So Jerry wants to go ahead and he wants to kind of get in touch with the two kidnappers to stop the plot or stop the kidnapping from happening. And in essence, he can't get in touch with them, and that's how the story kind of unfolds. So I wanted to talk here really, to me, the characters and their performances are the absolute standouts in this movie. And I don't think you have to go anywhere further than William H. Macy's performance of Jerry, who Jerry is just such a hapless character. He's so like pathetic, like he sounds pathetic, like he kind of gets like bossed around. And he plays such a depressing character. So I wanted to see, what did you think about Jerry's character, and how do you think William H. Macy did the performance for him?
I mean, he's pretty much reminiscent of another character we would see a few years later in Burn After Reading. He's kind of like Osborne Cox, a guy who seemingly has a very good life, is very successful, but is very, very unhappy, very much, a guy who gets pushed around a lot, and a guy who tries
Yes.
to make things happen, but it ends up blowing up in his face.
Yeah.
That
He always goes over his head, right?
right. And what I and to your point, what you were talking about earlier, what makes it such a great dark comedy is the fact that the plot is absurd, right? Because realistically, no one is going to go through all this mess to try to get money from their father-in-law. Like, they would try to be a bit more direct. But the fact that it's so absurd and the characters are taking it so seriously, I think that's what makes this so genius, is the fact that they want to see it through, no matter how ridiculous it is. Now I will talk about the accent, because the accents that everybody has, pretty much it's almost like the main character itself, but it's just being interpreted through all these different characters. I mean, really, the only two people who don't really have those accents are Gayar and Carl.
Yeah.
And that shows, because it kind of proves that they're the outsiders, they're the guys who
Yes.
aren't really part of that community. And in the TV series, we kind of see something similar, where Malvo, played by Billy Bob Thornton, doesn't have a Minnesota accent. Right, he's the outsider who literally comes out of town, kind of stirs the pot, and then leaves. It's kind of the same thing that we're seeing here, where you've got these two guys who really don't belong. They enter what seems to be like a normal environment. They stir up the pot, and then they leave this trail of mayhem all around them. That being said, I will say this: Peter Stormare does a phenomenal job as Geyer, because you really have no idea what's going on in his head, right? He's very much this thoughtful character, who really he's a man of a few words, right? He's one of those people who very much believes that actions speak louder than words, and you also get the impression that he's also a bit impulsive but calculating at times. Obviously, the big one is going to be when they kill that state trooper, and then he goes after the was that a teenager who passed by? He looked pretty young.
I don't know, because I think now so I know that there was two people, right? And I mean, teenager, maybe like early 20s, right? So I think kind of in that range as far as what they were. And if I recall correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, so I believe that the passenger, right, wasn't she pregnant, right? It kind of, that was the implication I got, that she was pregnant.
I think so. I know Marge was pregnant.
Yes, Marge is very pregnant as it comes up. So I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken, but yes, they were definitely a young pair of people that were in that vehicle that he kind of just goes after in order to, like, I guess, kind of dispose of the witnesses, so to say.
Now, I will say this too, because because as you may know, I mean, we do a series on this channel where we take a look at the plays of Shakespeare, and one of the things that stood out to me as I was watching this movie is that Carl and Geyer, they kind of have this Rosencrantz and Guildenstern vibe to them. So for those of y'all who aren't familiar with the play,
please, I have no idea what you're talking about right now.
In short, in the play Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are basically these two goons that are hired by Hamlet's uncle Claudius to basically kill him while traveling. But Hamlet kind of gets the jump on them, and he ends up getting them killed instead. So with these two, these two are pretty much the tools in the operation. They're not the mastermind of anything. They're pretty much, they're pretty much relying on instructions from Jerry and Shep to kind of make sure that things are going to to plan. And just like with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they don't, both of them don't really meet a happy ending. Especially Carl, who we'll talk about his ending in a little bit.
Yeah,
but
sure.
But I think there's just something that's so tragic about these two, because obviously these are guys who have made a choice in life to do what they do, but at any point you kind of think to yourself, they could just not do it. They could take things a whole nother way. Gayar didn't have to go after those two and kill them.
Yes.
He didn't have to, they didn't have to kidnap the wife, or they didn't have to, carve a bloody path that they did. But at the end of the day, they made these choices, and the choices that you make will lead you to whatever consequences may be, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah. And I will say too, right, something that I find interesting, right, because we talked about like Gayar, right? So we have the kidnappers, right? They go through the plot of kidnapping the wife. She kind of kidnaps herself a little bit, right? She actually kind of opens up a window, and they think they went out there, but just because Gayar kind of stayed behind, like he finds her in the shower there, and she pretty much captures herself by falling down the stairs. Which kind of humorous to see that she kind of renders herself unconscious as she's trying to escape out of there.
Yeah, I mean, she basically did all the work for them. So
yes, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, so you have them like as they're like going to the lake house, right? You mentioned Gayar shoots the cop in the head and then goes after the other two motorists that saw everything happening. And something that was always kind of interesting to me is like Carl's character. He never does anything like outright, I don't want to say bad, because obviously kidnapping is bad, but like he doesn't like murder anybody, right? Like Gayar seems to just like want to do it on a whim, right? Like he's very much like the guy that he doesn't care. He's just going to kill everything in his path. Whereas Carl is a lot more methodical, and he's trying not to make a big scene.
Well, I would say that I would say that Gayar, is both impulsive and calculated, because he's going around killing on a whim, but he also understands, hey, if I let those two go, then maybe that might lead to the cops finding more about us later on down the road. Now that isn't to say that he's the brains of the operation, because neither one are the brains. But Carl is very he's more. I wouldn't say he's more subdued, but he's a bit more afraid to do anything. He doesn't have, I would say he doesn't really have the balls to basically do what needs to be done. I mean, for God's sakes, Shep comes in, just beats the crap out of him with the belt, and he's completely hopeless. And everybody who describes him just says he's odd looking, but they can't really say how he's odd. They just say, he's odd.
Poor Steve Buscemi, but I mean, I do want to give him a whole lot of props, right? Because I think Steve Buscemi does such a good job with Carl of kind of being this guy that he's kind of, like you pointed out, right? He's kind of the pretty much like the voice of the two, right? Because Gayar like barely talks throughout the whole thing. So he's the one that we kind of hear much of the, I guess, thought process of our would-be kidnappers as he kind of goes through everything. Gets shot in the face at one stage and has a very unfortunate demise at the end. But his screen time, he does such a good job of just really like having this character here. Like I just really enjoyed what Steve Buscemi did. So I want to give him props for that, because I think like our main characters do such a good job with just like kind of creating their very distinct individuals. And I guess that'll like segue into our final person, right? And this was a surprise to me as I rewatched this, right? So we have Frances McDormand, right? Her character Margie, who's I would consider like when a lot of people think about Fargo, they think of this character, but she actually doesn't show up until we're a third into the movie, right? She shows up at the 33-minute mark, and this movie is barely over 90 minutes. And I always think that's interesting. When you think of Fargo, is Margie not the first thing that comes to mind for you?
I mean, she's very much, the stereotypical Minnesota nice lady,
Yes, absolutely.
Replete with the accent and everything, and that hardworking, optimistic attitude about her. Because what I really, really found fascinating about her was the fact, she's investigating a case where the bodies are just piling up, but she's just she's just living her life, and she's going, she's meeting an old classmate who we find out is mentally ill, and and you'll notice too, obviously she's 7 months pregnant, so food factors a lot into this film. I mean, I mean, she's having eggs, she's having Arby's. I mean, at one point they go to a cafeteria and she's got like her, a tray like loaded full of food, right?
Mhm.
She's not someone who, who's very much sickened by everything that's around her. She just kind of takes it in stride,
Yeah, no,
even as she's investigating, like, this ongoing, horrific case.
Yeah, this triple homicide, right? Which I think this is what it does so well, right? Because her character is just like this very relaxed, calm, and she's just sitting there. And like, I think for most people, right, if we were to just see 3 dead people, right, we'd probably have a pretty negative reaction to it. Now, obviously, she's a police officer. She, probably has some level of experience with this, but I always like the fact that she just kind of shows up, and she's just so casual with going through everything. Also, too, like, seems to be really good at her job, right? Like, she pretty much like is able to look at the scene, be like, oh, okay, well, someone shot that guy, and then these 2 must have seen it, so they came by and get it. And she's like looking at the footprints, and she's like, oh, well, this will be a big fellow. And it's really interesting to see how she's able to break things down so easily. And I think that's so funny because it just feels like another day at work for her, which I think is what works really well for this comedy, is having her in this type of role where she's just like, yeah, I'm just trying to, figure out this, very casual triple murder that I'm experiencing. And obviously I think she has the most recognizable accent, right? And I know we talked about that a little bit there, but I think it just goes to say that she does such a great job of like talking throughout this, that it is quite enjoyable. So props to her. I think she did a fantastic job with that in this role. But yeah, just interested to think that I always think of her in this film, and she just shows up so late in the film. Thought it was really interesting on rewatch.
But I mean, it's kind of appropriate too, because what else would she be doing? Like,
oh, of course, yeah.
Before
it makes sense. Yeah, absolutely right. It totally makes sense for the story. It just, like I said, interesting that I always thought about her being like the main character. I mean, which she arguably is, right? She's one of the main characters, but just interesting that she came in much later that I would think most people think if you've ever seen it. So I guess we'll kind of get a little bit back here with kind of like everything that's happening. So we got Jerry, who is meeting up with Wade, regarding getting like the ransom rights. So he wants to get this money, and I couldn't help but laugh that Wade is sitting there. He's like haggling over how much money he wants to give for his daughter. Because I think he says something like $1 million, and he's like, well, let's do 500,000. And I'm like, I just have to laugh at it.
I was gonna say, because you can tell Jerry hasn't thought this through. He's kind of like improvising as he's going along, and he's doing a really, really bad job. I would say it's a miracle that Wade didn't see through this at all.
That's true. Yeah, which I think that just goes to how absurd it is, right? And how they do such a good job of like just having this all work out with these characters. Like, I mean, Wade's character is so stoic. Like, he absolutely feels like someone we can see he's super successful. Probably has tons of money, right? And he's sitting here like haggling over his own daughter's life, right? And it just you can't just help but just be kind of crazed by it. And because he's like such like this stoic, strong character that just wants to do everything, this is where kind of like everything falls apart, because as Carl is kind of talking with Jerry over what needs to happen, Wade is overhearing this conversation of what's going to be happening, much to obviously Jerry not wanting that to happen. But Wade just kind of takes it upon himself, like, hey, I'm just going to do the job, and I'm just going to not worry about Jerry. I like how he always kind of puts him down, right? He's like, he looks at Jerry as being a screw up, right? He's like, nah, like, I don't want you to have to deal with this because I'm worried you're just going to screw up the drop off. Yet he was the one that wanted to give Wes money in order to get back his daughter at a cheaper rate, which, kind of weird. But we see Wade kind of meets Carl here. And this is where I think kind of we see Carl like finally kind of showing his true colors, right? Because I think I would describe him as subdued for some part of it. But we see him kind of threaten Wade. Wade pulls out his gun Carl shoots first, right? Then Wade shoots him in the face, and then Carl ends up killing him after that. But obviously,
I will say this: he's very exuberant in the way he kills Wade.
Yes,
like he's just, he just keeps doing it.
fed
He
up
runs
with it.
out
Yes.
until he runs out of bullets, and he just starts kicking the body. So
yes, yeah, he seems to be very fed up. Like everything is kind of fallen apart for him, and something he thought that was just going to be an easy thing would be a lot simpler than it turning out to be. And now he just like doesn't care, right? He's just like, whatever, I'm just going to kill this person and I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. So Carl ends up, getting the suitcase, and obviously there's a huge change here in how much money they have, because originally it was only supposed to be 80,000. Now there's substantially more. And it's, kind of funny where, he kind of looks in the suitcase and he comes to that realization. And I have to admit, I found this scene to be really hilarious, and I kind of was sitting there. I felt myself kind of like talking at the TV when it was happening, because Carl's like, well, he decides to bury the money, which kind of makes sense, right? Because he doesn't want to have Gayar or anybody else know about what's happening with it. But he just kind of buries it out in the middle of nowhere, right? Like there's just a fence. There's nothing but snow and fence line for like as far as he could see to the left, as far as he could see to the right. And what does he do to mark where he needs to stop for this? He puts in like this little ice scraper, and that's his mark. And the whole time I'm like, that's not going to work, right? Like everybody knows. Like you don't have to watch a whole lot of movies to know, hey, you're never going to be able to find that again. But it was just funny. It was just funny to see that happening. And obviously you have Carl. He meets up with Gayar, who has unfortunately killed off Jean. So I feel bad for Jean's character, because pretty much she was like kidnapped, and she didn't seem like a bad person at all. But Gayar is kind of like obviously not all there. So he's like kind of killed poor Jean off screen. And Carl and Gayar kind of get into this argument over the funds. Now, Luca, I want you to play the character of Carl for this. Knowing that you have all these extra funds, do you think it was worth it to get into a disagreement with Gayar over a couple of thousands of dollars? What do you think?
If you've been pushed to your limit at that point, if you've had to deal with so much shit while your your compatriot is just sitting, in a cabin just watching a woman while you basically have to do all the legwork, you kind of feel like at some point you do need some sort of financial remuneration for all of the shit you've had to go through, especially if you've been shot in the jaw.
Yes.
And you can barely talk.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I will say, like, I can sort of understand where he's coming from.
Of course.
I thought, mind you, I thought I found it satisfactory that he got shot in the jaw, because I was like, for a guy who runs his mouth a lot, and they mentioned this a lot, where when the cops are interviewing people, they're like, yeah, this little guy just kept bragging about how he killed somebody. I just thought it was poetic justice that he's finally silenced by having his jaw shot off, not shot off, but shot.
Yeah.
But to go back to your main point, this is the guy who's been the point man for the operation. He's the guy who's been talking to Jerry the entire time. He's the guy who's pretty much had to deal with Shep. Like I mentioned earlier, Shep was the one who had to go and beat him. He didn't go and beat Gayar. He ended up beating Carl, because Carl was the one who just wouldn't stop talking about what he was doing. So if I was in his position, I would feel like, yeah, I definitely do deserve, a much bigger cut, because I'm the one who's actually out there. I'm the one who's actually doing the legwork.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's actually had to, deal with all this stuff to the point where, half of my face is falling off. All you're doing is just sitting there eating TV dinners and watching a lady hyperventilate in a mask. So yeah, I definitely do deserve that. And if you don't like it, well, tough titties,
Yeah. No, it makes sense for him to have that breakdown because obviously he's absolutely hit his kind of boiling point, so to say. But gosh,
but I mean like even regardless of whatever work relationship you have, I mean if you're in in a work environment where where one person seems to be doing more work than the other, right? If you're the guy doing all the work, you would sort of feel like, hey, I deserve a bit more money because I'm the one who's actually having to go out there and do all the work, whereas you're just sitting there not doing anything. I think that's why a lot of people kind of feel resentment towards people in management. It's like, these guys don't do anything to get paid a lot more, whereas us, blue collar workers, we're having to get our hands dirty. So
sure, yeah. I mean, his explosion makes sense, right? And I know, like, it's a black comedy. There's no reason to sit here and like question the characters and the thought processes. But the whole time I'm like, gosh, if Carl just shut his mouth, he could have gotten out of that. So, but yes, unfortunately, Carl gets axed at this stage. Slight pun intended. So this kind of leads up to kind of like our closing moments, right? So Margie has been kind of on the hunt, right? And she's done like a great job of like kind of figuring out where the car came from. She confronts Jerry about it, and you see Jerry just kind of like flies off the handle in this moment, and makes it super obvious that he's a part of this and he has something going on. So he ends up fleeing the scene, and she's like just kind of goes up to the lake house knowing that there's someone that's kind of like loosely talking about the situations up there, and she just kind of stumbles upon the car, finds it, and she goes kind of in the back of the house, and this is where I feel like is I would say the moment that most people think about when they think about Fargo. We see Gayar is there disposing of Carl's body in a wood chipper. And obviously extremely gory, right? We see I believe it's Carl's foot that's sticking out at the end. So we see him pretty much just being dismembered there. She's able to apprehend Gayar, right? And that's pretty much how it ends. And then we also see Jerry is caught in the hotel room as he's trying to kind of weasel his way out of the hotel room. But that's like how it kind of wraps up. And I have to admit, like, kind of rewatching it made me really enjoy it again, right? And I think some of that's because I didn't really recall a lot about it, but I think it just does such a good job of like putting you in this world. And I think just kind of like the juxtaposition of like the characters, they just do such a good job of kind of creating this atmosphere, right? Everything from, how pathetic William H. Macy is to, his father-in-law, who's this like really stern figure that, doesn't think a lot about him. You got, these two criminals that are just kind of like bumbling idiots, or one is like, seems to be borderline psychotic with how much he can, just goes out of his way to kill people. And then you have just like Margie's just there, and she's just like this, happy-go-lucky person that's like, okay, time to go solve a murder. So it just does such a good job. The dialogue is great. The characters are super memorable. And I like how it's a very quick 90 minutes, right? I feel like there's no fluff. There's no extra stuff. I think if there is anything I'd be more interested in, right? And this is just me personally. One thing I would have liked to see a little bit more of was I would have loved to see more of Jerry's kind of relationship with Jean, right? His wife. Because I think that would have added some extra stuff in there. I think that if you spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I think that would have been interesting just to kind of get a better idea of the family dynamic. But that's just me nitpicking on what I think is a really strong movie. So,
well, hold on. Hold on, because we do have that that moment where Marge meets up with Mike, and I just thought it was a really random moment. I mean,
sure, yeah, we can talk about that. Go ahead, yeah, talk about.
Well, no, I mean, all I'll say is that he just randomly calls up and says, "Hey, remember me? We used to be classmates," and you come to find out that that when they meet, he tells her that he married another classmate who has since passed away, and he's been so lonely, and then he reveals he's had a thing for her. But then you come to find out he actually isn't all there mentally.
Yeah.
Which a part of me kind of wonders, why was that even inserted in the film, right?
I know.
Because I mean there isn't much going on, honestly, because it's Minnesota and all they're doing is solving a murder. But I felt like it kind of detracted from from the flow of the movie.
Sure.
But now another thing I will add too, because this is something that I mentioned when Dara and I talked about Burn After Reading, is the fact that there are parallels, right? So what I find really, really interesting about this movie, you kind of touched upon it too, is the fact that we're looking at two different family units, right? So we're looking at Jerry's family and Margie's family. So so obviously what we see at the end is Jerry's lost his entire family. He's lost his wife.
Mhm.
He's lost his father-in-law, and his son presumably is going to have to go somewhere because Jerry himself is going to be put away for quite a long time. So we kind of see a breakdown of the family unit, which in previous decades would not have been touched upon, right? The 90s was pretty much a period where the dysfunctional family was starting to become a thing. I mean, I remember seeing a speech where George H.W. Bush was kind of railing against how shows like The Simpsons were leading to degeneracy in the family home, in the American family. So I think what the Coen brothers do phenomenally is kind of present us, with these two different family dynamics. Jerry's family, which is very much, both of them are traditional families, but Jerry's family is pretty much in line with at that time as the modern family, where it's becoming quite dysfunctional. Margie, on the other hand, she can't wait to bring this baby into the world.
Yeah.
And at the end of the movie, she and her husband are talking about soon it'll be the three of us, and they just sit back and relax and just watch their their nightly show. But what we see with Marge's family is that it's a very normal and loving family. I mean, they talk about a bunch of little things, but they talk about it with great affection.
Yeah.
And the fact that
Husband's super supportive of her, right?
Yeah. And the husband also is he's very much hands-on, like, because rather than go back to sleep, he makes her breakfast, he helps her get a jump on the car, he brings her lunch. So what we see with with Margie's husband is very much the antithesis of what we see with Jerry. He's very much self-centered, very selfish, more interested in doing things for himself. Because you remember how Wade kind of asks him, well, what does Scotty think? And Jerry just says, he does double take. He almost forgets, well, who the hell's Scotty, and then he remembers, oh right, yeah, my son. Yeah, I'm sure he'll be okay. I mean, you can tell that Jerry very much is very much detached from his family. He doesn't, because you mentioned how you want to see how that relationship is. I think we pretty much get a good idea of what that relationship is like, right? It's a very one-sided relationship where Gene seems to be at least giving the good old college try, whereas Jerry's pretty much tapped out, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Margie and her husband Norm, they're pretty much, they're both in it. They're both ready to make this work. And I think that's the great juxtaposition that we see between these two, is the dysfunctional family that is Jerry, the family dynamic that is becoming quite popular with shows like The Simpsons, Family Guy, Married with Children. Name whatever show you want to you can think of from that time period that just became a hit. And then you've got Margie and Norm, who are pretty much still carrying on the ideal family unit that we see in the Norman Rockwell paintings and shows like Leave It to Beaver and all that stuff from like the 50s and 60s. And whatever conclusions you may want to come to, I mean, there's no doubt that the Coen brothers were tapping into the zeitgeist of the time period. And I would even go so far as to say they were kind of making fun of the idea of everybody's fascination with a dysfunctional family. Because if you watch a show like The Simpsons or Married with Children, the husband does something pretty stupid, but everybody kind of goes back to being normal, right? We never really see what could be the exact consequences, where when Jerry tries to do something that's extraordinarily stupid, he ends up suffering, the loss of his family and the loss of his freedom. So I think with what the Coen brothers are doing here is kind of showing us what the TV shows aren't really showing you. It's like I guess what we would say, the veracity of real world situations.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting too, and I really do believe that the Coen brothers, were sort of making fun of that trend and that phenomenon, because they just want to show just how absurd that fascination is. Because remember, because keep in mind, I mean, the '90s was a pretty dangerous time period, because we had all these events happening, everything like I mentioned earlier, like the Oklahoma City bombings, the Unabomber. We had all these lunatics running around, and people were just like fascinated by everything that was going on. I mean, I remember my mom was obsessed with the Suzanne Smith murders that occurred in South Carolina. It's about this lady who basically drowned her 2 kids in the lake, and then said that the kids were kidnapped by some random guy, and then come to find out she murdered her kids because she wanted to be with her lover. It was a very bizarre time period where if you ask anybody what's your favorite crime story going on, they would just pull it offhand, right? So the Coen brothers are kind of taking that fascination with true crime that's going on at that time period, and they're kind of just putting it on full display and saying, well, this is where this is the thing that you're obsessed with. Just look at it and just tell us what you think. But yeah, that was my takeaway from looking at this movie, because it's very easy to look at the film at itself and just see it as a black comedy, and it is. I mean, it's a wonderful movie in its own merit, and I think Ebert and Siskel even said themselves this was the best movie of 1996. But we also have to keep in mind that this movie is very much a product of its time, and you and I are both old enough to remember there was a lot of crazy shit going on at that time. So I think what the Coen brothers were doing was giving us a movie that was very much, a response to what's going on. So to go back to what you were saying earlier about how the movie starts off with that crawl, that this is based on a true story. Technically, it is based on a true story. I mean, it's not a very specific story that we would all be familiar with,
yes.
but based on what was going on at the time, I mean, you can take any murder trial or any crime that's going on and apply it to Fargo and say, oh, I could sort of see where that's coming from. They make the crime, as general or generic as possible, to where you can sort of say, well, it could fit anywhere around the country. It doesn't necessarily need to be a Minnesota thing or a South Carolina thing or a California thing, Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess final thoughts for me, right? I'm gonna give this a 4.3 blizzards out of 5. I really like this. I think this is exactly how you want to do that kind of like dark comedy, right? I think just it does it so well. And to me, the acting is the absolute standout in this. I cannot it absolutely just has just so many good characters that do such a good job, and all the acting to me was really on point for all of them. So was a great thing to kind of rewatch. Remember, some of these really strong movies that we had once a time ago, and it was really enjoyable. So, Luca, what do you got for me here for your scoring?
Well, I'm gonna give it a 4.5 out of 5, just because it's such a great story. And it is, and to all modern filmmakers out there, you don't need 2 hours to tell a story. You can do it under 90 minutes. It is possible. The Coen brothers have shown us how to do it. I think, I mentioned this already, but I think the one plot point that I didn't like was Margie meeting up with Mike. I thought that was something that really didn't have to happen, because it didn't go anywhere, really. But I just think that the dynamic between Carl and Gayar, the way that they're trying to make this crime work but failing spectacularly, I thought that was the comedic element itself. But I would also say too that there are so many other comedic elements in this movie that don't involve our 2 screw ups. I mean, there's that one scene where the officer he drives out a neighborhood road and he talks to the owner of a bar, and they're just chatting, and the conversation itself is, the content of the conversation is not funny, right? It's very dark, but just the way that it's delivered and the way that they're talking is just so it's just so silly because these are people, who very much just like to get on with it. They just see the good in everything, and they're talking about a guy who's basically bragging about having murdered someone in a bar. I just thought that one particular scene, I thought that was pretty good, pretty phenomenal. So
Yeah.
That's my score, and I will say that the TV series Fargo, on FX, is produced by the Coen Brothers. So if you're worried about it not being faithful to the original, so far I've only midway through season 1. I can say with confidence that it follows what we see in the movie, but it's not replicating it. It's doing its own thing while staying faithful to the original. And we also find out what happened to the briefcase that Carl buried all those years ago. But
Ooh, interesting.
But I won't say any further. You have to watch it. I can't do all the work here. But Lee, why don't you give us your take on the Minnesota accent? You've already heard my take. Let's hear yours.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's see here. What do I want to say?
Because as you're watching the movie, it's like when you listen to a song, you can't help but mouth along to the words.
Yes,
it's like you can't help but kind of give it the good old Lutheran church go, as it were.
Yeah, sure. So we'll be like, let's see here. Let's go solve those murders, don't you? Yeah, I don't know, but yes, there we go. So
he's too much of a New Yorker to say it, everybody. I mean,
yes.
But I was gonna say, I mean, what's also fascinating about this movie is because it's taking a part of the country we don't think about, that we would think is pretty boring, and kind of making it fascinating, making it interesting, right? Because if someone said to you, Lee, what are your thoughts on Brainerd, Minnesota? I mean, you would probably just shrug your shoulders and be like, I didn't even know Brainerd existed. So this movie just kind of gives us a look at Minnesota, and kind of make us think, oh, okay, that's kind of fascinating. But Lee, why don't you go ahead and take us out here?
Yeah, no, I appreciate everyone for listening to us ramble for however long we rambled. So probably it's always longer than I think it is. But I appreciate everyone's interest, and like I said, leave some comments. We always like to chat with people and get some feedback. So if you have any suggestions for us, any movies, TV shows you want us to check out, definitely let us know. And have a great one, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, don't forget to hit the like button.
God, you're so good at that.
We would greatly appreciate it too. Yeah.